So, for starters, a small disclaimer. I'm not getting paid by either Eric Barone or James Bendon and made this video out of my sheer curiosity and enthusiasm, as they say, for science. In a recent decade, I became a big fan of first-person sandbox-type games. You know, the ones where you have no single final goal and are generally free to roam around and do whatever you want with the stuff you find. I've spent my fair share of time in Terraria and Starbound. I somehow never got into Minecraft, but I learned every corner and secret of Stardew Valley, and Stardew probably was my favorite, up until Dinkum. Now I'm not exactly sure which of these two games I like the most. They are both awesome in their own ways. They have a lot in common though. As well as Stardew Valley, Dinkum offers us to escape a crowded busy megapolis to have a little life in a province by the nature. Just in case of Dinkum, that province happens to be not in some deciduous forest of North America, but in the wild Australian outback. Other than that, if you played Stardew, you will feel at home in Dinkum. Mechanics of farming, mining and foraging are almost identical. There's familiar calendar with 4 seasons, each lasting for just a month, and in both games you also get a little town with local folks, whose trust and friendship you have to earn as game progresses. Besides gameplay and setting similarities, Dinkum and Stardew Valley share another crucial trait. They were both created by an orchestra man, a single person competent enough to simultaneously play the roles of coder, artist, musician, scriptwriter, game master, and who knows what else. And that is an ability I genuinely respect. Stardew Valley was made by Eric Barone, also known as Concerned Ape, while Dinkum is made by James Bendon, who is known to be Australian. I'd say there is something magical and powerful in games created single-handedly. They always feel like there was a lot of soul invested in them, that they were crafted with love. There are lots of reviews on both Dinkum and Stardew Valley available on YouTube, and I doubt I can say anything new on graphics, soundtrack, gameplay or secrets of these games. Given the specialty of hardcore sci-fi channel though, I did a thing that probably nobody asked for. A more or less scientifically accurate analysis of how realistic are Stardew Valley and Dinkum compared to modern science and to each other. It might sound like a futile task for a first-person sandbox game, and well, it doesn't take an academic degree to place, say, Terraria or Starbound into the cake sci-fi hardness tier, with all their battle yo-yos, solarium ores, Archeos, ghosts and ancient chaos gods. However, both Stardew Valley and Dinkum might prove a challenge to rate that easily. So I propose to have a look at both of these games through the prisms of various science branches, and I'll start with old school Newtonian physics and meteorology. Basic light physics are good in both games, given the limitations of their graphical engines, but when we get to the harder metaphysics though, things get more complex. Dinkum makes you really feel each shovel of ground that you move. It is the first game that made me use the wheelbarrow to transport large amounts of soil. 900 dirt blocks don't simply fit in your pocket in Dinkum. However, a realistic achievement of that got later totally reduced by the dirt printer, which just magically produces matter out of nowhere. In Stardew Valley, on the other hand, you are just given the landscape and can do very little in terms of its modification. In Dinkum, objects tend to persist. You can't just destroy them with a magic rubbish bin button in your inventory. You can throw them on the ground, but stuff will stay there, like rubbish. Problem of rubbish also appears in one of the coolest Dinkum mechanics. You can search for ancient scrap with a metal detector and recycle some of the details for your mechanical craft projects. Stardew Valley also has this treasure hunting mechanics, but it is fairly simple and is never crucial to the game progress, except if you are hellbent on completing local museums, book and historical artifact collection. In its own way though, Stardew also speaks about pollution. You often catch all kinds of rubbish while fishing and may later recycle it, which is neat. It's hard to speak of gravity and inertia in Stardew Valley since it mostly exists in 2 dimensions, but in Dinkum physics of movement are fairly good, except maybe for the fact that there is no fall damage, which by the way totally exists in 2-dimensional Stardew Valley. Both games feature enormous inventories, which no mortal human could hope to carry around while flying a glider, riding a horse, hunting a crocodile, or fighting an immortal mummy. Dinkum has electric tools which need recharging, but the charging table apparently produces energy out of nowhere. In Stardew Valley, you can produce energy via solar panels or special lightning catcher rods, which are an interesting idea, but far from viable technically for multiple reasons. In Stardew Valley, you cannot really go deep into the water and or immerse objects there, so there's really not much to be said about liquid physics. It's probably worth mentioning that there is a submarine which opens a huge pool when submerged, and you can kind of fish there, and no one on board dies in a horrible death when it opens. In Dinkum, water is fairly realistic, except for the fact that rivers don't really flow and there are never any waves in the sea. As for weather, it is realistically sophisticated in both games. There are seasons, there are stormy and windy days, and when it rains, you don't have to water crops. In Stardew Valley, storms leave a lot of stuff washed up on the shore the next day, while in Dinkum, storms produce mysterious thunder rag items, which appear where lightning struck, make an ominous crackling sound, sparkle, and can be either sold for a significant amount of money or broken to get 4 opal gems. In other words, they are pure magic. Lightning behaves much more scientifically in Stardew. It just breaks a tile where it hits, or charges a battery if there's a lightning rod nearby. In both games, days are shorter in winter and longer in summer, but in Dinkum, since we are in southern hemisphere, it is weirdly warmer in the north and colder in the south, which takes some time to get used to for a European guy like me. In Stardew Valley there's TV channel, and in Dinkum there's a weather pool which both predict tomorrow weather with 100% precision. As a gamer, of course, I can see how all the mentioned unrealistic stuff is fun and good for gameplay, but my final verdict on physics and weather in both games probably would not be very high. Rubber tier for both Dinkum and Stardew Valley. Next, we have geology and chemistry, and the basic recipes, such as fertilizers and explosives, seem fairly reasonable in both games, though I would give Dinkum higher score for not being afraid to show and use animal poop. Stardew Valley, on the other hand, requires coal to smelt metal ores into bars, while Dinkum furnaces don't need fuel of any kind at all. Speaking of metals, Stardew Valley features progression from copper to steel to gold to iridium. Gold doesn't make sense. It is more valuable than steel, fair, but it's actually very soft in comparison and is probably one of the worst metals to make a tool from. Iridium is harder than steel, alright, and much more resistant to corrosion, but making a hoe or an axe from iridium seems to be an overkill, given how rare the metal is. In Dinkum, the main crafting ores are tin, copper and iron. I often found myself in need of copper and tin long after I've discovered iron, so there's really no bestest metal, each of them just has its own use. That, however, gets under question with the introduction of berkonium ore, which does not exist in real-life periodic system, is very rare, very valuable, in other words, it has all the symptoms of being unobtainium. Besides berkonium, another unobtainium of Dinkum is opal. Opals are one of the main indigenous Australian gemstones. In fact, Australia mines more opals than any other country in the world. In real life, however, opals are just slightly harder than steel and are much more brittle. Their engineering applications are limited to abrasive materials, insulation, fillers and ceramics, so opals are not really technically feasible as a core for a high-tech artifact. One more species of Dinkum unobtainium are ruby and emerald shards, but of these at least rubies have a reason to be in high-tech artifacts, since they are core material for the lasers. Stardew Valley has its own share of unobtainiums. Prismatic shards, diamonds, cinder shards, golden coconuts, and in most cases their use in crafting recipes is far from scientific, such as making the magical fairy dust or sacrificing it on some altar to turn your children into birds. Stardew Valley gets extra points in geology for having a rich variety of real-life minerals and a museum devoted to collecting them all. There is one issue here, however. In real life, land is never that rich. Certain minerals tend to occur in certain geological layers and never form in all shapes and colors in one place, which seems to be just the case in Stardew Valley. In Dinkum, things are different. You can only find quartz, pearls, opals, amber, rubies and emeralds, and pretty much that's it. Apart from quartz and maybe pearls, they are all rare, and game makes you feel it. In Stardew, as well as in most other first-person sandbox games, you mine gems just along the way, same as you do with ores or timber. They just stack into inventory and you run along. Not so in Dinkum. It requires you to carry every valuable gem separately, and you can only carry one at a time, and you have to be really careful with swinging weapons around it, since it can break. That's usually where you start looking for a wheelbarrow or some other vehicle, like a motorcycle, a car, jet ski, glider, or even a helicopter. These can all help you to carry lots of stuff at once. Transport crafting materials are quite realistic, and the transport itself is very useful. Even after you activate teleportation towers all over the island, you still need all types of vehicles to move around comfortably, which I cannot say about any other first-person sandbox game. In Stardew, you have a wheel cart railway, a bus and a boat, which are all essentially teleportation stations, a moving train with poorly packed goods, which is just a source of random loot, several cars that do not ever go anywhere, fleet of boats that appears for a few winter days, plus various vehicles you can't control that appear in character development cutscenes. The closest that Stardew can offer to the Dinkum vehicle standards is Horsey, which is still nowhere near as useful as transport in Dinkum. Transport, however, would be a matter of our next category, engineering. And for now, to conclude on chemistry and geology, I'd rate Stardew Valley as rubber tier and Dinkum as iron and glass tier. Speaking of transport, one notable issue in Dinkum is that none of the vehicles actually require any fuel at all, and are all essentially unbreakable, which kinda undermines the realism a little bit. Besides transport, you can craft a lot of useful power tools in Dinkum, like jackhammer or chainsaw, which I cannot say about Stardew with its iridium axes and pickaxes. Craft recipes are generally intuitive and logical both in Dinkum and Stardew Valley. Dinkum, however, introduces a whole category of modern craft materials, such as gears, light bulbs, wires and old smartphones, while Stardew Valley relies on mysterious ancient alien dwarf tech, iridium and some radioactive bars for its most technically advanced crafts. The most technically advanced NPC in Stardew Valley is blacksmith, while in Dinkum it is scientist. Sure, there is scientist in Stardew Valley as well, but he is more of zoology botany type of scientist and does not actually produce anything really unique and useful in terms of gameplay, except for helping you to either grow mushrooms or breed fruit bats in a cave. The Dinkum scientist, Franklin, is one of the coolest and most valuable characters to have around. In Franklin's workshop you can buy repair toolsets and blueprints for DIY crafts, as well as order some advanced construction projects which use up a plenty of money, resources and time to get made, but, as Franklin always promises, I usually find them quite useful. In Stardew, you also have a radio and aviation enthusiast character as well as a robot engineering enthusiast character, but then again, as well as local scientists, they don't bring much to the table besides the cute cutscenes. Processing machines work in a very similar way in both games. You load some resource, you wait, and then collect some advanced resource. Dinkum has the already mentioned zero energy requirements issue, while Stardew Valley is guilty of having crystallarium, which grows valuable minerals out of thin air, and a magic cat statue, which somehow produces iridium on a regular basis. So all in all, Dinkum gets tungsten tier in engineering, while Stardew only can rise as high as rubber tier again. With that, we can move on to the last of the hardest science groups on the list: post-Einstein quantum and gravity physics, time, astronomy and the such. In both games there are sun, moon and stars in the sky, it's just that in Stardew Valley we don't see them very often because of graphic limitations. Since both games take us into some parallel world, the exact positions of stars are not that important. In terms of what's really important about local space, I would first of all mention the stuff that comes from there. In Stardew Valley we sometimes get a meteorite, which is hard to break and is rich in iridium. This is actually very believable. Iridium is abundant in asteroids, and a lot of it got deposited on our planet as a gunshot residue of that ancient meteor that killed the dinosaurs. In Dinkum, we sometimes get crash-landing satellites, which tells us two things. First, we exist in much more technologically advanced society here, and second, our local South City space industry has yet a lot to learn. Fallen satellites can be scavenged for rare tech parts, which is nice. It's strange that no government or corporate people ever show up to scavenge the crash site, but that's another story. In Stardew Valley we also have an astronomer character, and some character development scenes with a telescope, which is a certain win in terms of astronomy. That, however, gets muddied by the presence of astrology, in the shape of a fortune teller who gives us an important advice on mood of spirits and whether you will have good or bad luck today. When we get to the temporal dimension, things suddenly look worse for Dinkum. Time in Dinkum is not linear, you see, nor is it cyclical. The thing is, Dinkum time can somehow curve into late pockets. In Stardew Valley, you get your daily marathon to the bed until it's 2 o'clock, and if you fail, you drop unconscious and wake up only in the next morning. Not so in Dinkum. There, you can go into the dark realm of late and exist there, like for eternity, for as long as you don't die or go to sleep. You get tired quickly in late, but with the right amount of food, you can keep doing stuff like crafting, construction, agriculture, animal care, fishing, and cooking. In no time, you might find yourself becoming a nocturnal animal, working on your architecture and farm projects for hours and hours of peaceful darkness and solitude, with small half-hour blinks of daylight in between. But however convenient, romantic, or unhealthy extended late-time pockets can be, they sadly are very unscientific. Speaking of time and space, Stardew Valley actually also has aliens, ancient aliens to be precise. They kinda crash landed on the planet long ago and adapted to live underground, and they are kinda dwarves now. The whole concept is interesting to explore, but sadly having sapient extraterrestrial species on a planet doesn't seem to have changed it all that much. I mean, there is a literal ancient alien stealing stuff from people at night and lurking in a nearby cave by day, and the biggest news around still seems to be whether Governor will like this year's potluck soup or not. Besides that, both games feature teleportation, and while Dinkum's version is much more sciencey looking, most modern scientists agree that human teleportation is probably not technically possible in principle. So in quantum and gravity category, Stardew Valley lives up to iron and glass tier, while Dinkum just gets rubber tier. Together with the rest, the average score in the hardest sciences leaves Dinkum in iron and glass tier, while Stardew Valley only gets rubber tier. Or so I would say, but there is one more issue here, the magic penalty. It just so happens that magic is inherently toxic to the hardest of sciences, and Stardew has a lot of it. The worst offense in Dinkum is probably Bat Altar, on which you can sacrifice 20 bat wings to get a bat glider, but pretty much that's it. In Stardew Valley, besides fairies and witches, there are also forest spirits and just plain ghosts. Then there is Wizard Tower with a real-life wizard that makes potions, teleports around, and has some dark altars in his cellar and at his ex-wife's place, who is by the way a witch. And then there is that lucky cat statue that produces iridium, and that statue you get on your second anniversary from a ghost of your granddad if you lived up to his ideals. Oh, and you can also gain Galaxy Sword by sacrificing Prismatic Shard on the altar in the desert, and so on and so on, so I guess I'll just drop Stardew Valley one tier down in hardest of sciences, which is from rubber to cake tier, and from now on I leave its magic alone for the rest of the review. Next, we have biological sciences, and the obvious place to start is local fauna. In Dinkum, fauna is rich. There's plenty of insects, fish, and bottom crawlers that correspond to widespread Australian species and appear seasonally. And the best part is, you can donate them all to the museum. In Dinkum, museum is not about minerals and artifacts. Instead, it's more of a mini zoo. As of current version 0.7.6, you can't yet donate large animals to the museum, but interacting with them in the wild is fun enough. You can hunt them, you can tame some of them, you can catch them in cages and send to the local research center, you can contain them in fenced enclosures, and you certainly want to keep wild herbivores away from your agricultural projects and carnivores away from livestock and out of your city. Animal management is actually kind of a big deal in Dinkum, and it's also quite realistic. Each of the animals has its own behavior and needs a special approach, and there's bloody lots of them. Jackaroos, crocodiles, cockatoos, kidneys, moose, warmoose, sharks, and notorious fire-breathing bush devils? Wait, what? Why are Tasmanian devils so big and breathe fire? Why are frill lizards so big and have an electric field now? Why are wombats now cows and how are platypuses sheep? And why is there a giant crocodile that can cause an earthquake? Well, Dinkum is not exactly Australia, but rather a creative reimagining of it, and I guess in some alternative parallel world, all the Dinkum fauna could have very well existed. After all, it's not uncommon for large herbivores to grow horns. There are bugs that can almost produce fire, and there are dozens of animal species that can, to various degrees, electrocute. Giant wombats and bizarre platypus relatives are known from the fossil record, so their presence makes a lot of sense too. As for huge dangerous boss versions of regular fauna, the so-called alphas, well, I see very well how they fit into gameplay, but they also might have some parallels in real life, like for example a mature male elephant seal who gets aggressively territorial during mating season. In Stardew, you can grow basically the same categories of farm animals as in Dinkum: eggs, milk, wool, but otherwise fauna is bleak, for as long as you stay out of caves. You might encounter butterflies, an occasional rabbit or squirrel running around, maybe some birds, of which the only notable one is crow, which can harm your crops. But basically that's it. No crawling insects, no visibly swimming fishes, no predators or other creatures you would expect from a rich temperate forest biome. To make matters worse, there are magic bears, literate mice who sell hats, a whole species of sapient parrots, as well as aforementioned magic nature spirit species called Junimos. If you go deeper into Stardew Valley dungeons, your zoologist logbook might get updated with even stranger species, such as walking skeletons, little funny black urchins from Spirited Away, giant arthropods which could only exist in the atmosphere of Carboniferous, an entire genus of aggressive slimes, a species of mysterious pitch-black humanoids who do not seem to have any coherent evolutionary history and are generally magic, as well as, real-life witches and fairies. To be fair, Dinkum has its own share of weird fauna as well, like glowing crocodiles and poisonous lizards you can find underground. Glowy crocs, however, seem to be evolutionarily related to the land crocs, and maybe even are the same species, just more specialized for the caves, getting themselves a symbiotic fungus as a lantern. There are known examples of, say, hermit crab and sea anemones, so I guess a union between crocodile and fungi is kinda possible as well. As for lizards, they seem to be evolutionarily related to the electric surface frills, again, just a more specialized cave subspecies. So I'd say suspicious-looking animals don't distract but actually add more points to the Dinkum biology rating. Given all that, Stardew Valley only gets cake tier rating for fauna, while Dinkum rises as high as a diamond tier. More than that, given its setting, Dinkum still has a huge field of zoological add-on opportunities. I mean, we haven't yet seen Benton's reimagining of such iconic Australian animals as koalas, numbats, sugar gliders, budgie parrots, marsupial moles, snakes, and many others. Besides that, just until fairly recently, Australia was inhabited by elephant-sized wombats diprotodons, bigger and scarier version of Komodo dragon called Megalania, marsupial lion Thalaco Leo, and many other amazing creatures that could get a second life in a game. The other new fauna opportunity here is, of course, New Zealand, which has a whole bunch of cool animal species of its own, like kiwi, tuataras, flightless parrots kakapo, and its own set of recently extinct megafauna, like moas and giant eagles. Now, where was I? Next on our list are flora and microbiome, and I must start with a major blow to Dinkum here. It has plants that photosynthesize in the dark somehow, and there is quite a lot of them, both in terms of sheer numbers and species diversity, and there is zero sunlight where they grow. There is a species of glowy flower here, but, well, to fuel such an ecosystem, that flower would need to have a tiny nuclear fusion reactors instead of cute luminescent bulbs. In comparison, Stardew Valley has some underground flora as well, but it's fairly modest and only grows on upper levels of caverns. Dinkum flora, however, is not all that bad. There's actually a very realistic growth mechanics for pumpkins and watermelons, which can stretch vines and bear fruit far from origin plants. In Stardew, several regular-sized pumpkins, melons, or cauliflowers sometimes coalesce magically into a huge one, which for some reason doesn't seem very believable to me. Other than that, agriculture works well in both games. More bonus points go to Dinkum for sprinklers, which demand a nearby tank of water to function, which is realistic. Dinkum also gives us Australian eucalyptus woods, which feel amazing just to walk around them. I've learned about existence of such plants as bottle brush and wattlebush, spinifex, finger lime, and guandong, and there are also aforementioned glowing mushrooms, which are quite a real thing in some Australian forests. Stardew Valley, on the other hand, has its own share of native North American trees, such as maples, oaks, and pines, its own berry brushes, herbs, flowers, and mushrooms, and most of them only appear seasonally or grow in special certain places. In Stardew, each type of tree gives its own type of sap juice, syrup, resin, or tar. They all, however, give the same wood when chopped and differ just in type of seeds they drop along with it. The only other significant type of wood is hardwood, which you use for advanced construction projects and get from ancient-looking stumps, which for some reason magically regrow in the forest with no visible attempt to perform photosynthesis. So I guess it's 1-1 in ignoring power of sun for now. In Dinkum, there are 3 types of wood: palm wood, gumwood, and hardwood, and they all have different properties and uses. Besides that, you have to saw the wood into planks before you can work with it, and you have to use nails to craft stuff out of wood, which kinda sounds more or less like real wood to me. Speaking of trees, in Dinkum you can basically plant them where you want, as long as there's a patch of free land. In Stardew Valley, your forest is limited to your farm, and all the chopped trees in the woods will just magically regrow back into the spawn points right where they were. Bonus points to Stardew Valley, however, for not having player as the only seed disperser. Trees very well multiply themselves around your farm. Dinkum in turn gets some extra points for having Rain, a nomad girl who specializes in plant care and has a whole little farming shop separate from the general store. She even offers a whole botany book that she wrote herself. Both Dinkum and Stardew share a problem though: there are no microscopic life forms. Both games can very well be described as worlds without rot. None of the foods you gather are going to spoil regardless of where and how you keep them. You can leave it on the ground or in your chest or carry around in your inventory for ages, but your 6 quality milk and 58 tomato will stay nice and fresh forever in both Dinkum and Stardew Valley. Stardew Valley makes it slightly better by at least background mentioning infectious microbes in medicine-related dialogue, and jack-o'-lantern turning into a rotten mess on the first day of winter, while Dinkum just enjoys the general lack of bacteria, viruses and the such, and that's it. Speaking of remarkable crops, in Stardew you can grow an ancient fruit from an apparently well-preserved, recently extinct plant seed, as well as some mysterious sweet berry, and both look nice, but don't actually add or subtract much to the scientific value of the game. In Dinkum, you can grow a bizarre mighty spread, a whole jar of apparently bread spread, which grows like some cabbage and costs a fortune. I did some research and found out that there is Australian traditional spread named Vegemite, which the game probably references, made out of mix of vegetables and spices in real life. Honorary mention and the final bonus point for Dinkum flora goes to the underground Venus flytraps. These make some sense actually. Real-life carnivorous plants evolved in places deprived of nutrients, which might be also true for light-deprived underground. I mean, I can see how eating huge lizards or fat maggots could actually bring more calories here than photosynthesis. At least to some degree, they atone for the undergrowth photosynthesis in the darkness, and given its multiple bonus points, Dinkum gets iron and glass tier in flora and microbiome, while Stardew sadly only gets the rubber tier. Next one is anatomy and medicine, and oh boy, both games are a bit of a mess here. Given the lack of microscopic life forms, you of course never get sick in neither Stardew Valley nor Dinkum. As I mentioned earlier, character you control can carry overwhelming amounts of items without getting vertebral hernias, and while some objects bear more real weight in Dinkum, you also don't get any injuries falling from heights there. One bonus point goes to Dinkum because there are no magical healing and restoring potions, while Stardew has some. But in general, to regain strength and health in both games, you have to eat and drink. In Dinkum, there is also a somewhat more realistic bloated condition, which doesn't allow you to eat more than 3 food items in a row. Nutrition mechanics in both games, however, have another common set of issues. In both Dinkum and Stardew Valley, you can just eat or just drink all the time, and you won't get dehydrated or malnourished. Relying on a huge stack of fairy bread or pancakes for all your energy needs won't give you diabetes, and drinking just local brews won't turn you into a bitter alcoholic. The closest that both games come to sickness depiction is tired condition, which happens when you overwork, and poison status, which some animals or monsters inflict on attack. Being poisoned temporarily prevents you from eating, which in turn makes you unable to heal for a while. Sadly, there are no such things as antidotes or vaccines in both games yet, but in Stardew Valley there's Squid Ink Ravioli, which makes you immune to poison, as well as to getting burnt, frozen, slimed, blindfolded and jinxed, which I'm pretty sure are properties this dish does not have. There is also no way to boost your maximum health or stamina except for temporary food bonuses in Dinkum, so you don't grow into a tanking Hulk as the game progresses, and local crocodiles might be as lethal on day 100 as they are on day 1, which I find to be highly realistic. In Stardew Valley there are magical snacks like iridium snake milk and mysterious star drop fruit which do turn you into a little bit superhuman. On the other hand, unlike Dinkum, Stardew Valley has its own little hospital, with a general physician and a nurse, and when you collapse you sometimes come back to senses in there. Villagers also attend the doctor for regular annual visits, each in their own prescribed time, but in practical terms there is very little real use for doctor in the game, in both games actually. Both in Dinkum and Stardew Valley, you never get a brain concussion or break a leg. There are no lasting consequences, and even after you die, you just wake up with some money and items lost. So as of now, Dinkum health realism gets rubber tier at best, and Stardew Valley only gets cake again. The last biology feature we have on the list is a set of Etology, ecology, and evolution, a general evaluation of how local ecosystems function on different levels and how they came to be in the first place. Dinkum just excels here, basically in all directions. Animal behavior is unique for every species and detailed for tamed animals. You can have different whistles to call for different species, as well as make your dog follow you around the outback. Dinkum animals also happen to understand and like the sound of guitar, which is totally possible if they associate it with person who brings food. In Stardew Valley, well, farm animals kinda do their own thing and can be mostly interacted through petting or extracting resources like, wool, milk, rabbit legs. Other than that, they just randomly wander around the farm, except only for Horsey, which behaves more like a motorcycle and patiently stands exactly where you leave it. Speaking of wild animal behavior, well, in Stardew Valley they are mere decorations, just appearing out there for a while to look pretty. The only cool find probably is jellyfish migration, which is a thing that could probably happen and is demonstrated in very nice detail. There is sapient parrot civilization and they for some mysterious reason happen to trade construction services for golden walnuts, and I'm not really sure if they count towards realistic animal behavior. In Dinkum, nature of the wild is possibly one of the best things that game gives. One of the first things you notice in Dinkum is, in general, like in Stardew Valley, local fauna doesn't try to kill you. Terraria and Starbound are much more hostile worlds with only a handful of harmless creatures who don't really play any significant role. Stardew Valley is generally a barren world devoid of large wild animals, with small ones being more of effects rather than objects or subjects. In Dinkum, large harmless herbivores are the norm. Jackaroos and moose run away as you approach, kidneys and frillies just plain ignore you, and only a handful of species are inherently aggressive: crocodiles, bush devils, warmoos, and sharks. Carnivores are often seen attacking herbivores as well as each other, and sometimes you can even feel like a forensic studying the pattern of crocodile teeth and bush devil flame sacks scattered along the shore in the woods. Predators even consume one piece of meat that falls out of the prey. Also, I'm pretty sure that my domestic wombats graze grass. It doesn't grow much around their enclosure. Sadly, food chain goes no further. Wild herbivores don't really eat fruit and flowers, they just hang out around. Also, none of the animals try to catch any of the various insects, and I'm not sure if kidneys ever show any interest towards termite mounds, which should kinda be their main food source. That all, of course, is an understandable sacrifice that Dinkum makes to playability, and probably the only issue it has in this category, unlike Stardew Valley, which again has plenty of issues. In Stardew, you can just chop the trees, and they later grow up anyway, or you can befriend a magic bear, and he can clean all the pollution for you. In Dinkum, on the contrary, you must continuously think about sustainability and environment. You need a lot of wood for crafting purposes, and while gathering it you can totally devastate a whole little biome by accident. I have destroyed one war moo nest near my home before I learned that they do never respawn, so I encircled the remaining one with a fence to turn it into a little wildlife sanctuary and keep that wild helmet head out of my way. Now I think twice before chopping a tree or expanding the city. I have even recently started a little wood farm on a barren stretch of land to leave local nature alone. Also, notably, Dinkum has toads, which come out during rain and look a lot like cane toads, the notorious invasive species and one of the major threats to the modern Australian ecology. For now, there's nothing you can do with toad skins in terms of crafting and production, but I expect that one of the future updates might include some ecologically conscious taxidermist NPC who would offer top dink for pest extermination, so I keep storing them. Speaking of evolution, well, in Dinkum you get huge ammonite shells from time to time, which is kind of realistic, though fairly minimalist. Paleontological finds like skulls and full vertebrate skeletons are rare, and maybe they just await us on the lower stages of the cave elevator in future updates. We have some good real proof of evolution around though. We see some variation within species, as well as species separated by biomes, as well as species far removed from each other, with each one evolving its unique set of adaptations. That's more than enough proof of evolution for me. Stardew Valley in turn has paleontology NPC, and its own set of fossils to unearth, so rich in fact that I find it very hard to believe that so many ages left their trace around the valley. No known fossil site is that abundant in amount of eras it recorded. In Stardew Valley there are fossilized ferns, trilobites, ammonites, ancient amphibians, giant extinct snakes, giant extinct bats, giant extinct sloths, and yeah, dinosaur eggs from which you can actually grow a dinosaur, which is sadly unscientific at all. DNA has that deplorable tendency to decay. The oldest DNA recovered up to date is about 6 million years old, while dinosaurs perished 66 million years ago. All in all, Dinkum gets the highest possible diamond tier in Etology, Ecology and Evolution, while Stardew only gets rubber, and that's mostly thanks to jellyfish migration, seed dispersal on the farm, and rich fossil record. Now we can have a look at general biology science score, which doesn't look like much for Stardew Valley. With just 2 out of 4 being rubber and the other 2 cake, it lands into intermediate works hardness tier. Not cake, but still not much, and this time even without any magic penalty. Dinkum, on the opposite, seems to be in its most scientifically advanced element yet. It gets tungsten tier. Next, we move to social sciences, and the first one on the list is economy. To get some general understanding of local economies, I propose we have a look at the opposite ends of the economical spectrum, the poor and the prosperous. In Stardew, we meet a hobo named Linus who lives in a tent in the woods and is kind of an outcast in the local community. He rummages through trash bins at night and claims to live in the wilderness out of his own choice, because he enjoys nature and stuff. Well, that might be as well true. Man is weird enough to wear clothes made out of leaves, while there are obviously lots of nice people around who could probably donate something not so Peter Pan to wear. We also meet Morris, who is the head of a local supermarket store. That man obviously just buys his way through the life. He serves some ominous mega corporation and tries to suffocate the little local business. Morris is basically the closest the Stardew Valley can offer us in terms of Nemesis class antagonist. You can side with Morris, by the way, and choose flashy supermarket discounts to the local oldie store charm, but the game does everything to show us how this is super boring and counterproductive. The game, in other words, makes a case for defense of small local businesses against colossal corporations, which I guess is a fair and a healthy message that most economists would probably agree on. In Dinkum, things are different. For starters, all the local inhabitants appear consistently only after you build a house for them, so there are no homeless. There is a guy named Ted Selly who is kind of a traveling hunter, but he always just passes by and doesn't really count to homeless people's statistics. Out of the rich, Dinkum has Milburn, a nice little nod to the Monopoly game, a thrifty senior with a monocle who runs local bank. Milburn is the only one whom you can't get on the island by improving a relationship. With all the others, you can either become friends, or you can just buy enough of the stuff they sell so that they feel like moving on your island will be profitable. Milburn does not offer you the option to become friends. You just develop your community to the certain economical degree, and then you receive an offer to build a bank, and with the bank comes Milburn. You can become friends after that, of course. You can become friends with almost everyone in both Dinkum and Stardew Valley, but more on that later. Bank in itself is fairly simple but realistic. You can invest some money, wait to accumulate interest, and then get more money. Milburn just runs the procedures, and despite being probably the richest man on the island, he still is a part of the community and a part of the town, not some evil force you have to defeat. Besides banking, Dinkum also has a peculiar debt system. When you order a deed for a new building, you don't pay right away. Instead, you generate a debt. This debt is not only yours, but is also shared with other citizens of your island, since I guess everyone would also benefit from opening, say, a bar or a museum. Thanks to the donations, debt slowly increases over time and can eventually even vanish on its own. In general, both games grasp the core mechanics of economy quite right. Nobody has enough skills to produce everything on his own, thus we trade. While in both games you can craft, say, a scarecrow or a torch, there is a lot of stuff that can be only made by the others, more competent craftsmen, and should be purchased from them. You can offer a lot for sale as well: garden produce, animal goods, fish, gems, and in return buy clothes, furniture, buildings, farming supplies, and tech goods. Games might differ a bit in what you can craft and what you have to buy, but the core logic works quite well in both. As for logistics of sold goods, we never really see anything delivered to or from both Dinkum and Stardew Valley stores, but in case of Dinkum we at least get a good explanation where does it all go and why is it valuable. It just so happens that there's a nearby depressive metropolis named South City, from where you have moved to the island. Inhabitants of that South City consider all the good from your island exotic and pay the top dink for them, dink unsurprisingly being the main currency in Dinkum. So you sell stuff to John and he somehow transports it to the South City. Selling goods might get rather magical in Stardew. There is no special currency here, you buy and sell everything for gold, labeled as G for short. In Dinkum, you can only sell during working hours, until dark, while in Stardew Valley you can just dump all of the stuff for sale in the bottomless box right next to your house, whenever you feel like it, and at night, mayor of the town comes to gather it all and leaves some money in return. Speaking of the nearby cities, Stardew Valley has Zuzu City, which is never depicted as that much of a Gotham as South City in Dinkum. You go to Zuzu City on several occasions in character cutscenes, and it looks alive and nice, just like a small city near the even smaller village might look. At first I wondered, why do people choose to live in that grimdark Dinkum South City at all, while there are such fun lively islands in the nearby seas? But then I suddenly realized that it's actually quite in line with the current trend of urbanization, and I myself am not that different, choosing to live in a capital rather than some village, so I guess that's fair. One problem that plagues both Dinkum and Stardew economy is the cost of goods you buy and sell. It seems like your action do not influence demand and supply. In fact, prices never change at all, which makes me feel a bit like living in a heavily planned economy where government sets all the values. Even after you sell several hundreds of eggs or iron ore or grain bags, their market price won't plummet and you can sell hundreds more for the same profit. Despite this major market failure, otherwise, given its much more advanced banking and debt systems, Dinkum gets tungsten tier in economy, while Stardew Valley only gets iron and glass. Speaking of laws and society, on the law part both games kinda fail. There are no judge or policeman NPCs, no jail or police station buildings in both Stardew Valley and Dinkum. Whatever you do, you are basically incapable to become a criminal in both games. Stardew Valley, however, provides us with a legal basis to operate the land. According to the plot, we inherit old farm from our beloved grandpa at the very beginning of the game. There is an official letter, so we own it, and are fairly limited to just our land patch in major construction and gardening projects. In Dinkum, things get shady and fishy if you look that way. Your whole reason to be on the island is because some old lady called for a volunteer to accompany her to her old home, where upon arrival she gives you her father's journal and encourages you to grow up to goals mentioned there, apparently organizing and improving the land, and at no point to my memory you are ever granted any ownership rights in it all, nor is it explicitly stated that the old lady herself owns the island. On the other hand, Dinkum offers us licensing system, which determines what you can't and can't do in terms of interaction with the environment, like you need licenses to chop trees or drive bike or work in a mine, a lot like we have in the real world, you know. All the licenses are available for purchase from an old lady who lured you to the island in the first place, and you pay with permit points, which are some sort of local experience points, so I guess that's a fair basis for issuing licenses. It is questionable how a single old lady could be competent enough to empower us in all the possible areas of arts and crafts, but if the main character can handle that, then so probably can some determined old lady. She tells she got her licensing authority from the South City, and thus we kinda act in the framework of a local legal system after all. Speaking of society, well, both games have a sort of social dialogue through advertisement board, but the similarities end right about here. Society is generally much more complex and developed in Stardew Valley. Besides evil corporation Georgia, there is Adventurers Guild and Zuzu City Rarecrow Society. There are public library and public baths, and besides many community holidays, there are Girls Sports Tuesdays and there are regular Friday parties at the bar, and the whole Stardew Valley in general is about rebuilding the community center, which somehow gets achieved through the benevolence of local spirits, but whatever. So with all the dialogue, cutscenes, and even simple day-to-day character schedule animations, we can witness an almost real little society moving around. In Dinkum, members of society sometimes chat randomly, sometimes come into each other's shops, and in the evening most gather in the Tucker Box, if you are lucky enough to have built Tucker Box. Otherwise, Dinkum society just wanders into the darkness, and it's not uncommon to find the old wise license lady spookily standing in the dark woods after midnight. Your neighbors in Dinkum request a lot of insects, fishes, clothes and furniture, but there doesn't seem to be any arthropod collector community or pescatarian grill club or second-hand furniture exchange system or anything. There is just request board, there are personal requests, and otherwise everyone is generally kind of on his own, and everyone looks a little bit lost. It is a real loss, since Dinkum actually has a lot of potential here. I could imagine it having optional laws such as all villagers stay around light sources at night, or all volunteering villagers get armed with basic weapons to defend against predators, or clothes exchange community market at the gazebo every second Sunday, or tax raise, donations to the community chest become bigger. But that kind of legal system would also probably demand to introduce some sort of community voting, which brings us to the politics, the next category on the list. For now, laws and society ratings will make rubber tier for Dinkum and iron and glass for Stardew Valley. So speaking of politics, in Dinkum we have kind of a controversy. On one hand, you get licensed and thus probably bound by some obligations to the chain of command coming from the South City. Theoretically, you are in their jurisdiction. On the other hand, you are kind of friends with most of the island inhabitants and probably have to take their opinion into consideration before, say, building a helicopter pad or a crocodile sanctuary in their backyard. In practice, however, no requests or commands ever come from the South City, as well as you can absolutely ignore what could locals possibly think about your landscaping solutions. Basically, you just run the island as if it was your personal city-state. You decide where streets will go and where buildings will stand. You decide who will live in the city center, who gets the suburbs, and who gets banished on the top of the hill near the ocean. Nobody will ever protest your decisions. Locals just walk around, mind their own business, and obediently adapt to whatever changes you've made during the last late. The city-state that you run is not only authoritarian, but is also terribly corrupt, since everyone around is either your friend or a close trading partner. It doesn't matter much, however, since friendship cannot get converted into political power in Dinkum, and it feels like another lost opportunity. One of the annual events could have been the election of city mayor, with the title traveling between NPC characters, bringing changes to their work schedules and city environment, but for now I'm afraid it's just cake tier for Dinkum and politics. In Stardew Valley, politics are much more real. You own just your land, everyone else owns and operates their dwellings, and there is a city mayor who runs things around the Pelican Town for quite some time already. We know that nobody really runs in the elections against him, so he keeps winning, and it's no wonder considered how far the guy can go to earn the support of local villagers. Mayor himself is in jurisdiction of a governor who runs under some higher authorities of a country that we live in, the Ferngul Republic. We even get to know that there is some other country, Gotoro Empire, which is, as one character describes it, a ruthless bunch. In fact, Ferngul Republic is currently at war with Gotoro Empire, and one of the characters is a soldier that comes home from that war with PTSD. Besides all the political hierarchy, Stardew Valley provides us with a crucial element of democracy, voting procedure. In the community center opening scene, evil capitalist Morris tries to lure everyone back to his corporate supermarket in a last pathetic attempt of 75% discount. And one of the possible endings is for all community to vote and decide to boycott evil corporation, which drives Morris and his crew out of business in Stardew Valley. The other way to resolve this conflict, though, is for a local store manager to have a fight with Morris and punch him through the roof. So I'm not really sure on the state of democracy in Ferngul Republic. The overall state of politics in Stardew Valley, however, is detailed and smart up to the degree of diamond tier. The last but not the least in the social science sector is history and archaeology, and both games have something to offer here. Stardew Valley has a library and a museum devoted to history along with geology. The variety of artifacts you can find around the place is stunning, and unlike the cases with geology and paleontology, I suppose it's quite possible to find them all around one place. It would prove then that Stardew Valley has quite a rich history and has been inhabited throughout multiple stages of local civilization, like, say, Mediterranean region in our world. Studying history in Stardew Valley can prove beneficial in practical terms other than filling museum shelves. If you collect and study all 4 of the Dwarven scrolls, you can learn their language and thus communicate with the living representatives of their species. We don't really learn much about the exact details of Stardew Valley history, and there are also still questions about what's the twist behind the early mine exploration and who built 100 floors of Skull Cavern or Magic Forge on the top of the volcano, but other than that, history is strong in Stardew and earns tungsten tier. In Dinkum, it seems history of the island is not that long and rich. Most of the historical artifacts you unearth look like they've been made in the last 100 years. It might be explained by the island being habitable for not a very long time and just until fairly recently, which is proved by the stories of an old lady who is kind of local. Going deeper underground, however, we discover seemingly endless and surprisingly well-preserved wooden structures with burning torches and underground brick houses, which for some reason all have a treasure chest inside. Chests, among other stuff, might contain a perfectly preserved and still usable buckets of paint, or some contemporary-looking tech parts, or a magic cloud in the bottle that can summon rain, or a magic stone wand that can create boulders out of thin air. There are lots of rusty car remains in between these mysterious houses with chests, as well as there are some glowy bat altars, and there is not very much sense in how it all came to be here, besides just providing character with random objects of interest to explore and loot. All that mess would probably drag Dinkum history into rubber or even cake tier if it wasn't for local characters. There are no historians or archaeologists as of yet, but instead, Dinkum can offer something even more curious, little pieces of history baked into the characters themselves. The thing is, Milburn is far from only reference that Dinkum does character-wise. The traveling guy I mentioned, Ted Sully, wears a creepy bucket mask, buys things you have caught or killed, and sells weapons, so at first I somehow assumed that he is a local tradesman iteration of the serial killer Ted Bundy, but oh, was I wrong. It turned out that Australia, as well as America, had its own Wild West phase before the country assumed modern looks, and one of the most prominent historical figures from these times was Ned Kelly, a legendary criminal and a leader of the gang, whose members wore heavy metal armor in their last shootout with the police. I mean, how cool and crazy is that? Speaking of more recent Australian history, we get to meet another character, Irwin, who is an obvious reference to Steve Irwin, both in looks and in craft. He sells animal and animal care goods. So, given such living historical characters, Dinkum gets iron and glass in history after all. In general, that leaves Stardew Valley with average tungsten tier in social sciences, while Dinkum gets stuck on the border of iron and glass and rubber tiers. Let's call it aluminum tier. It seems tables have turned, but the study is not over yet. The fourth and the last on the list are the humanitarian sciences, and I'll start with culture and arts. As for cultural aspects in Dinkum, besides the colorful reference characters, I could mention many other little details like mighty spread, outback windmills, opals, abundance of iron, red sand, iconic flora and fauna, traditional food, and as a result, at least to some degree, you feel immersed into Aussie world. The game doesn't offer much in terms of culture activities though. You can do photos with either tripod or hand-based camera and then showcase your best works in the museum lobby. I have some pics of my girlfriend and some curious natural phenomena here. Also, you can go wildly creative, modifying landscape and architecture, turn your surroundings into an expression. That is art enough for me. Also, there is a guitar, but you mostly play for farm animals and it doesn't really sound good. Also, you have biennial culture event, bug catching competition, which seems to be popular among the local folks. Also, you have one big cultural holiday, Town's Day, celebrated annually around the first day of island colonization. There are balloons and hot snacks, it's kinda fun. Ah yeah, and also in December there is Santa-themed NPC, but probably that's about it. There is no artist or singer NPC, no opera or nightclub building, no concert or exhibition type events, just photos, architecture, broken guitar, and several holidays. Remember how I mentioned that large peaceful herbivores are the norm for Dinkum? So, well, it seems in the same way artists are the norm for Stardew Valley. As time passes, you learn that local inhabitants carve wood, paint, write novels, play piano, play ocarina, or play board games, or play in a rock band, or play with a sword in a graveyard, or play in a local sports team, or play in casino, or make photos, or make some weird fashion therapy clothes, or are into meditation, or have a secret tea house, and that's just the activities about which you learn in cutscenes. There's more. Besides artists of all possible species among the townsfolk characters, Stardew Valley also has television system with several channels and more than half a dozen festivals, each with its own unique entourage and contents, many themed around traditional Christian type events like Easter, Christmas or Halloween. There is also famous painter Lupini, who appears on a night market for several nights in a row at winter to sell his work in the docks. You can really have lots of fun on Stardew Valley festivals, and if that wasn't enough, there's even more. The movies. Indeed, you might help the city develop a movie theater in the abandoned building left of the evil Joja Mart, and thus celebrate small community victory over corporate capitalism by going to see some romance comedy or horror thriller. In general, movies are a rich and powerful addition to the world of Stardew Valley culture. The only edge that Dinkum could possibly have over Stardew Valley in culture and arts dimension is the fact that Dinkum arts are more interactive. You could play with camera to get a better photo and also check out my marble lighthouse waterfall with crocodile sanctuary. That, however, doesn't add that much to the sheer diversity and opulence of local culture, and thus Stardew Valley undoubtedly ends with diamond tier here, while Dinkum gets iron and glass. Next category is linguistics and ethnicities, and well, Dinkum does very well here. I'm not sure if real Aussies really talk like that all the time, but bloody legend, beauty, mate, nice arvo! For some reason, lots of characters express a concerning desire to smelt some puppies, which I am still a bit confused about, but other than that, I feel like I get what everyone talks about, and I learn a bit of Australian stuff on the way. Bloody beauty, mate! On top of that, Dinkum has peculiar dialogue voiceover sound, which really adds to the atmosphere of some foreign place. Speaking of ethnic diversity in Dinkum, it is quite good as well. We have a wide spectrum of races here, which is quite a tendency in modern big cities, and it makes sense here, since most of the inhabitants of your island apparently migrate from South City. There are some exceptions though, like Rain, who belongs to a nomad tribe that wander around the world. Given all that, I leave Dinkum with diamond tier in language and ethnic aspects and move on to Stardew Valley, which doesn't do that well here. Sure, there is some ethnic diversity among the villagers, but fairly little of it. That might be just the norm in Ferngul Republic, we just don't know. Maybe it's just ethnically homogeneous like Japan. To be fair, there is also Desert Trader, a non-communicable NPC, apparently of some Indian-themed foreign origin. We never meet anyone from evil Gotoro Empire, but we can witness some dwarfs, witches, goblins, mermaids, magic black people, and magic forest spirits, and despite being unrealistic physically and biologically, these magic folks kinda add to the ethnic diversity pool of Stardew. In Linguistics division, everything is fairly simple in Stardew Valley. It's good old well-known American English, which most characters speak with their own little undertones and mannerisms. As for sound, Stardew Valley provides just a nice old 8-bit bleeping. There is mystic language of Junimos, which you can learn by drinking magic potion, as well as there is dwarf language, so in the end I guess we leave Stardew Valley in solid iron and glass tier, and move on to the next object of study, religion. In Stardew Valley, we are introduced to a whole local religion of its own, the Church of Yoba. Given that our character in Stardew is primarily a farmer, it is easy to see why, besides being the guardian god and the creator god, Yoba is also the god of plants and gardening. According to local scriptures, he creates world by planting seed. Church of Yoba seems to be fairly well defined in its symbols and aesthetics, as well as we get the general message of its scriptures. It's kinda good old Abrahamic message, Jewish or Christian, but with a bit of a tribal fertility god spin. Name of Yoba gets mentioned when people pray for blessings and protection, as well as in Thank Yoba for certain glimpses of luck. Yoba is worshipped not only by people, but also by the mysterious black humanoids of the underground as well. More than that, not everyone worships Yoba among humans, beginning with the local store owner and his family, in whose house the religious corner of a town is located. It turns out they didn't build it, but rather inherited from a previous owner of a building, and now they allow townsfolk to use it, but don't really attend it themselves. In fact, daughter of the store owner practices occultism and spiritism, which I am not quite sure Yoba is okay with. Besides store owner family, Stardew Valley gives us a character who is an open atheist, and for some reason also a miserable nihilistic alcoholic with suicidal tendencies and the saddest story in the entire game. It looks like Eric Barone does not approve people being too far from God, but that's not the end of the story. There is also Ring of Yoba, an artifact that can magically grant you invulnerability for a while, and a physical manifestation of Yoba, a proof that God exists, which sadly throws us out of realm of science. However, I have already hanged magic penalty on the hardest sciences in Stardew Valley, and it won't be fair to apply it again. What truly keeps Stardew Valley religion away from Diamond tier is the fact that despite its complexity, it lacks diversity. I can see how a religiously homogeneous Christian-like society might come to be, but it's hardly believable that we never ever meet followers of other faiths or at least find some of their artifacts. It might as well happen that Desert Trader believes in some other god than Yoba, and maybe the evil Gotoro Empire has some enemy deity they worship. Or maybe Wizard and or Mr. Chi secretly serve some demon and are responsible for the untimely demise of a previous store owner, the one that built Yoba's shrine, but these all will be speculations, and for now Stardew Valley only gets tungsten tier in religious studies. As for Dinkum, well, in Dinkum we kinda have no religion at all so far, but I would not hurry to trash it into cake tier. World of Atheists, of course, looks weird and not very believable. At some stage every civilization goes through religion phase, and its cultural trail can't disappear entirely without any trace. However, at no point we are specifically told that local characters are atheists. The proper term to describe them would be probably not religious, which is a widespread state of mind for many people in recent times. Specifically, modern Australia is on the border of getting into top 5 club of most non-religious states in the world, losing in per capita occurrence only to such bastions of atheism as Belgium, Azerbaijan, United Kingdom, Japan, Czech Republic, Sweden, and of course China. In case of Dinkum, we can imagine that none of our new settlers decided to bring their deities and rituals along, and so a little non-religious society grows. In other words, lack of religion in Dinkum is not necessarily a bad depiction of religion status. In here, religion might be just kinda locally extinct, as well as our wars, diseases, and death. That approach, however, doesn't bring Dinkum in religious matters any higher than rubber tier, and on that point we get to our final category for today, psychology. In both games you no doubt deal with realistic characters rather than cardboard cutouts. Each of them has his own story, goals, strong and weak sides, unique visual pattern, and little mannerisms of speech. I guess Dinkum scores bonus points for Franklin alone here. That geeky dude always has some funny way to phrase stuff. In both games, you have a scale of hearts, which demonstrates your current relationship level, ranging from complete strangers to best friends. In Stardew, in addition to that, you can also become married to one of the young, attractive characters, who also happen to be the most detailed ones. Most of the local psychology gets unpacked in cutscenes, which are all well illustrated, well written, and feel like nice, little slightly interactive short films. All of the motivations and coping mechanisms of characters that we learn about feel quite familiar and human. You as a character can intervene very little and sometimes get just the backseat of a mute watcher, but when you get to choose how to react, the results very much influence how others see you. In Dinkum, we have none of that. Characters don't tell you personal stories of how they came to be, they just walk around, sell and buy stuff in their work hours, and can give you a request to fetch some item usually, which upon fulfilling will benefit your relationship. If you refuse their request from the start, it's fine, but if you take it and then don't complete, it actually makes your relationship worse. The other realistic thing about psychology in Dinkum is that relationships tend to decay over time. You might raise it up to maximum, but if you don't keep in touch with the character, it will slowly slide down to more neutral. In Stardew Valley, relationship decay happens as well, but kinda slower, and instead of request-fulfilling system once per day, we get gift-giving opportunity twice a week. Every character has his own likes and dislikes, and in time you kinda learn their tastes. There are certainly some request preferences among Dinkum characters as well, except for the weird fact that they all too often, for some reason, want me to get them a fly. What the hell do the locals do with these flies, seriously? Do they all secretly have Venus flytraps? To be fair, there is a thing that Dinkum has that Stardew doesn't. In Dinkum, you can talk with characters multiple times per day, for basically as long as you wish. With time, characters become a bit repetitive, and for some reason at some point many of them say need text instead of some little narrative piece or a comment on some aspect of life, but basically you can spend the whole day chatting with anyone if you want to. In Stardew, you have only one conversation with character per day and 2 gifts a week, and that's it, and that doesn't look good in comparison with Dinkum's endless conversations and 1 request per day. So, despite some downsides, psychology system in both games is pretty advanced, to at least iron and glass degree, and Stardew Valley gets even more points for its character story cutscenes, which certainly add a new layer of depth. Even more than that, I would give Stardew Valley Diamond tier in psychology because of amount and complexity of problems it touches upon. Stardew Valley speaks of such issues as PTSD, alcoholism, suicidal behavior, dealing with clingy ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend, dealing with your age, health or social status, dealing with a new dad that your divorced mom has suddenly married, dealing with a prolonged absence of parents, or even coping with death of parents. And at the same time, Stardew shows us people having dreams, striving to achieve their goals, fighting their inner demons and learning how to become better selves, which altogether sounds like enough reasons for Diamond tier to me. So now we can sum up what both games have gathered in the Softest sciences, which would be Iron and Glass tier for Dinkum and Tungsten tier for Stardew Valley. It's even higher than that actually. Stardew Valley falls into the borderline zone between Tungsten and Diamond. Let's call it Ruby tier. Whew, that took longer than expected, and I still have a feeling that I missed a lot, but whatever. Now that we've been through 4 general science groups and got an average from each, we can sum up these averages and get an average total, to finally answer the question, which of the games is harder in sciences, Dinkum or Stardew Valley? So, brace yourself for the results. Overall, in average, Stardew Valley gets Iron and Glass tier, and Dinkum gets Iron and Glass tier as well. Well, you might say, mate, that's not how you make a bloody tier list video, there should be some difference or it's not interesting. And I would say, oh yeah, there actually is some interesting difference indeed. For starters, while both games fall into the average of the middle range, they do so from the different end of the spectrum. Dinkum rises above the average a bit, while Stardew Valley barely escapes getting into rubber tier. To be fair, it's not exactly iron and glass, but rather the aluminum tier. Next, more curiously, games get to their averages in completely different ways. Dinkum holds stable around most of the spectrum. In 2 out of 4 science groups it has Iron and Glass tier, with only biological branch being notable for Tungsten, which is more or less counterbalanced by the social science branch getting Aluminum tier. Stardew Valley, instead, makes a dramatic curve. It comes to the very high Ruby tier in humanitarian sciences, then it gets solid Tungsten in socials, but then it falls down to Vox tier in biological sciences, and then goes full soft, and lands in Cake tier with hardest disciplines. Does that mean that Stardew Valley is worse? No, not at all. Both games are awesome. Stardew Valley is just slightly softer in science on average, as well as terribly soft in the hardest of disciplines, but there is another side of coin to that. In case of Stardew Valley, the fact that it's less than 50% science actually means that it's more than 50% fantasy. So if you prefer magic over technology as well as more advanced social and cultural systems, then Stardew Valley might be just the right game for you. It's worth mentioning, however, that as of now Stardew Valley has version number 1.5.6 and is obviously near the end of its evolutionary journey. Eric Barone is known to be working on a new game, Haunted Chocolatier, and is probably unlikely to return to Stardew Valley with major changes anytime soon. So there it will probably stay for a while, just below iron and glass in aluminum tier. Ironically, scientific hardness rating of Stardew Valley happens to be equal to that of a local symbol of evil megacorporations, pollution and unhealthy diet, a Joja Cola can. But hey, for every ounce that Stardew loses in science, it gains in fantasy, and I consider this to be a fair bargain. As for Dinkum, at the moment of creation of this video, as of version 0.7.6, it rightfully hangs in the middle of science fiction balance and playability, in the middle iron and glass tier. When it finally reaches 1.0, end result might even score tungsten tier or slide into rubber tier, so I will probably give the game a second look when it's there. As for now, if, in terms of setting, you choose The Expanse over She-Ra and Princesses of Power, Dinkum is your obvious choice over Stardew Valley. As any mortal human, I am of course limited in the scope of my knowledge, so my conclusions might be a bit biased. I'm generally competent in biological disciplines, but might be not as good in most other branches, so while I do my best to improve, please take my judgment with a grain of salt and leave a comment if you see where I'm wrong. Before I finally wrap up this review, I'd like to thank my super supportive girlfriend and thank you for watching. If you want to support the channel, like, subscribe and stay hardcore!